Okay. So this is what we did before. And even though it looks like there's a difference, there isn't, because it's a very small sample. And then we did the same thing. N equals 1,000. 100, 0. Here the error bars are much smaller, and so you would probably end up with a probability value, or the likelihood, that it's perhaps one chance out of 10,000 that this would be due to chance alone. That actually it shows here that vitamin C appears to work. Okay? So that's what statistics does. It allows you to actually evaluate quantitatively whether there's a difference between one group or two groups or three groups or how many groups you're testing. Let's say you're doing a bunch of different cancer drugs, and you're doing some at different levels and then different types of cancer drugs. You can set up all kinds of different designs to test various, let's say, the various drugs and different levels of the drugs and all that. And you can actually see where there might be, what might be the best regimen or something like that. So you're not just stuck with two. You can have as many groups as you want, depending on the, you have to have a big enough sample to do it. So statistics is important. It's how we evaluate whether a study found an actual difference in terms of what they were testing. Now, it turns out, as I mentioned, vitamin C doesn't do anything for colds. You can take as much as you want. You'll just pee it out. It's water soluble. Okay. Oh yeah, what if people don't get enough vitamin C, what's the name of the disease they get? Scurvy, right. Just testing. Good. Okay. Now, here's another example. Obviously, even though this is, let's see, 50 versus 60%. And with those kinds of error bars, it would be no difference whatsoever. But let's say we had a bigger sample, and here, let's do this. N equals 10, and then N equals 1,000. And then there would still be a significant difference. Okay, so this is misleading. You have to know what the variation is around the mean. And these are, the mean is the average, just so you know. So here's the average. And then we'll say these are the 95% confidence intervals. Like if there's overlap, it means there's not significant. If there is an overlap, it means it is significant at some probability level. And with the computer and the programs we have, they give you an exact probability of, 0.049 or 0.0001 or something like that. Okay. Now, we went over this, a good experiment, a well-controlled experiment. There's one variable that you're testing, and that's the variable, the independent variable, that is tied to the predictions that the hypothesis makes. So if we're talking about vitamin C, and vitamin C protects individuals against a cold. And we test the one variable because we give one group vitamin C, and we give another group a placebo that looks like vitamin C but isn't, so they can't tell the difference. And the researchers actually who set up the experiment, they don't know the difference either until after the experiment. And then they shoot cold virus up their nose and give them a cold, and we see which ones get a cold and which don't. And the prediction, which is what we're testing, is the number of individuals who actually get a cold. That's the dependent variable. The independent is getting vitamin C or not. And, of course, we want to minimize bias, so we want to control for subject bias. They don't know what they're getting. And the researchers don't really know either until after the fact. The data have all been collected. And then we finally do what we just did, was a statistical analysis. Okay. Now, not everything is testable. We can't necessarily do actual experimental tests, like one group gets this and one group gets that. A good example is historical sciences like evolutionary biology and in many respects like looking back in the past and what fossils you find in certain areas. Geology is another one. Astronomy and cosmology. These are all things that all we can do is observe what we can observe. We actually can't go back and, let's say, take the Earth and replicate it 1,000 times and then let it go forward and see, in terms of testing our theories, let's say, about geology and how things work, and see what happens. And we have, geology has a whole bunch of theories, let's say plate tectonics, which means that the continents are all on these big plates. The plates are made of heavier material. The continents are actually what we're in right now is lighter material. And they travel all over the globe, and that's why we actually have different continents that have moved around. And now that's a hypothesis that there's a lot of, or a theory, plate tectonics, that has a lot of support, but we never ran those experiments. Now, they've run mathematical models to model that sort of thing, and the evidence so far is, but it's not like we actually did the experiment. Okay. So, another thing is there's ethical problems, let's say. So, an experiment testing the effects of alcohol on driving. Those in the treatment group drink 2 ounces of 80 proof bourbon. Those in the control drink 2 ounces of water colored to look like bourbon. Now tell me something. Do the subjects know which group they're in? If you drank a shot of bourbon with a blindfold on and then a shot of water, would you be able to tell the difference? Yeah. Okay. Right. So, this is an example where you really can't hide the treatment effect, and you can't control for the placebo effect here. And then there's a lot of observational studies where you do kind of surveys, or you do, let's say, latitudinal studies all at the same time, and you want to look at obesity rates in different countries. So you go out and you measure people in different countries. And then you see, is there a difference in obesity rates? And we can get means, the average, and standard deviations, and we can actually do statistics, but we're not actually doing an experiment. We're not certainly getting at the mechanism of why one country might have people who are more obese than others. Same thing with, let's say, diabetes or something like that. So, and also, when you do things in the lab, let's say you're doing a behavioral study, and you do it in the lab, you can control everything. The temperature, when you do it, the exact subjects you use, all that kind of stuff. But a lot of times, unfortunately, animals don't behave in a lab like they do in the wild. So what you want to do is, then you want to take your experiment and put it out into nature. And you can even do a manipulative experiment. The trouble is, you don't have control of all the variables. You're going to do this, let's say you want to do 10 animals in terms of caching seeds or something like that, and 2 different kinds of seeds and what they do with them. Well, this is going to go over a period of time, and one day it's warm, one day it's cold. You have all this extraneous variation that's going on. Now, the thing is, in the lab, the rodents might not cache the seeds at all, whereas in the field, they actually will behave normally, we'll say. But you still don't have a perfect experiment because you can't control all the variation. And so we do the best we can. Now, a lot of times what you do is you find out, well, if you really set things up properly in a lab where you can control things, you can get the answer you need. But like I did a lot of stuff with the seed stuff, and it was all out in the field. We'd set up these big enclosures and put little rodents in and all that kind of stuff. So I just want you to know that you can't always do a well-controlled experiment. Okay, so here we go. Now, this isn't exactly true. If a hypothesis actually stands up against many rounds of testing, it means there's a lot of evidence to support the hypothesis. A theory looks at something, a larger phenomenon. And a theory is often made of many small hypotheses as far as how things actually work. So if we look at evolution, and we're looking at natural selection, like we just did with those crabs and everything, and the snails. What we're actually doing is you're testing whether, in fact, there is such a thing as natural selection. And if you do that, you should see differences in the frequency between each generation of the snails that are being eaten by crabs versus a bunch of snails that were not eaten by crabs. And you can set up that experiment, and you should see differences that over time, the group that was eaten by crabs should eventually evolve thicker shells and be more immune to the crabs. Whereas the other group that didn't have crabs, there's not that kind of selection on it. So we make those kinds of predictions. Now, we could also, so that's one hypothesis about, in terms of how natural selection works, but what is the actual mechanism? Well, it might be, tell me, for selection to actually work, you have to have variation in, let's say, shell thickness. So a shell that's 9 millimeters thick, a shell that's 14 millimeters thick. If there's all the same number, let's say 14 millimeters, no evolution can happen because selection has to work on the variation that's there. So you can actually test the hypothesis. What is actually driving evolution? And one of the assumptions is that there is variation. So that's a hypothesis. You have to test that as well. So a larger theory has a whole bunch of hypotheses that go into it. Just like Einstein's theory of gravity made a bunch of predictions about a bunch of different things. Okay? So, a theory is a hypothesis, but it's a broader explanation for some large phenomenon that we see. A theory becomes a scientific theory when it has been tested extensively and has not been proven wrong. In other words, the theory has a bunch of hypotheses and those make predictions, and if the basic tenets of the theory have not been refuted, then there's evidence that that theory has some support. So the germ theory of disease, which was formulated in the 19th century, but actually even some of the Greeks actually supposed maybe there was something like that. They weren't seeing very tiny things, but they didn't have microscopes or anything, so they didn't know. And so they had this whole elaborate thing about different kinds of substance, like black bile and white bile and blood and all this. And that's why things had to be in balance. And if they got out of balance, people got sick. Well, we know that's foolish. The germ theory came along. Someone proposed it. They proposed it because, well, microscopes had been invented a couple of hundred years previously. And people saw cells that were invisible, and they saw bacteria that were invisible to the naked eye. And then finally, someone started thinking about putting that together. Now, there were still barbers where you would go and get your blood. You get bled because of the humoral hypothesis. You know, you get bled, and that would supposedly restore things. And those people usually got worse, as you can well imagine. But over time, more and more evidence came up to support the germ theory. And so nowadays, that's one of the theories of why we get sick. There's others, of course. There's other causes for disease in humans. Cancer is one. There's a bunch of them that might not be due to infectious diseases. Do you guys, anybody in here believe this guy? Come on, someone does. Isn't he too cute to not believe? No? Look at those eyes. I mean, a guy like that I really just want to kill. Right, you know. You want to mess a guy up like that. Now, there might be some people, some guys in here who would give this guy a run for his money. Don't stand up, because we'll mess you up. Pat, remember that. Any good-looking guys in here? Really like this guy? Beat him up. Okay? Okay. Now, so, by the way, we'll get to this when we talk more about evolution, but there's something called sexual selection in terms of individuals, organisms that get more mates than others usually have higher fitness. Okay? So some guy like this, now he may not marry anyone, but he might produce, let's say, lots of babies or something like that. Okay. Now, so there's, law versus theory. A law is an observation. And then usually what happens is you see an observation like laws of planetary motion that Kepler came up with, but he had no real explanation for why we saw what we saw. It took Newton to come along and provide an explanation for gravity and planetary motion, and then that was Einstein came along and made it newer. So there's a difference between a law and a theory. A law is something you observe. That's you observe over and over and over again. A theory is an explanation. Okay. Now, I've talked a little bit about doing experiments, and a lot of behavior experiments were done in a lab with rats, with white rats or mice, running a maze and all that kind of stuff. Okay. And the rat or the mouse is a model organism. They've now been bred so that certain groups that you bred have certain characteristics, including there's a lab rat that is incredibly obese. And it's actually a model of obesity in humans. And there's another one that presents diabetes. There's another kind that where they're more likely to get cancer, that a specific kind of cancer. And we do this because these are model organisms. We know a lot about them, and we can do experiments, and we can kind of look at the same sort of disease that is in humans that we want to study, but we can't do it in humans. We have to study it first in animals. And so here we have 4 model organisms. Here we go. Here. E. coli. This is a worm called elegans, C. elegans. There's some folks here that are doing lots of work on them. You can do all sorts of stuff. They're looking at sleep. Turns out worms sleep. They're animals. They're surprisingly, it looks like a lot of the same things that cause them to sleep cause us to sleep. Fruit fly. You've probably heard about fruit flies. We've sequenced the whole genome, in fact, of all these different organisms. And we can actually look at how mutations affect fruit flies and then extrapolate to, let's say, people. Evaluating scientific information. Okay, most of you, when you read about stuff, about science, let's say, you'll probably read it on the internet, maybe in a magazine, maybe in a newspaper. You probably will not read a scientific journal. Doesn't mean that you couldn't try, and you can certainly find enough at this in our library online at this university. But most of you will be reading stuff in kind of general sources, like newspapers and whatnot. And what happens is someone, like a science writer, will look at a lot of the journals each week that are coming out, some of the big stories, and they'll write about them, about new discoveries. And he'll look at the actual primary sources. So the primary source is an actual study. Like if we were going to do a study on vitamin C and colds, and we would do the study, and then we'd collect the results, and we'd evaluate it with statistics, and then we'd write it up. We'd say, da-da-da, this is exactly what we did. The protocol, you'd have to say exactly what you did, so it could be replicated. And then you would show at the end that there's no difference between the two groups. Okay? Now, that's been done, and you could actually go into the literature nowadays and find old studies that did that. People aren't doing it anymore because people have done it tons of times, and there's absolutely no effect on colds. There is an effect on scurvy. So, there's a difference between, now there's some things like, let's say Scientific American or Discoverer magazine. Those are secondary sources, but they're a little more advanced secondary sources. Okay, so Cheryl Van Buskirk is the one I was talking to you about, who is working on these little worms and sleep. And she was looking at epidermal growth factor. It's a hormone that signals other cells that induces behavioral quiescence, in other words, sleep, in these worms. And let's see, it was published in Neuroscience, top journal, Nature Neuroscience. The first part is just an abstract or a summary of what they found and what they did and what they found. Then there's usually an introduction that starts off explaining what they want to, what's been found in the past and what they want to find out now in terms of new things. In this case, the signaling pathway. And then they also describe, let's see, well, they didn't show it here, but they usually describe the experimental design. And then here's the results, and from all the experiments that they did. And then, let's see, finally, we don't have the whole journal here, but there'll be a conclusion, and they'll write up, this is the findings that we had. And then it'll get published in the literature. So this is primary source. Okay, so these are secondary sources. Now, in terms of how science works, there's a lot of different debates about, in terms of philosophy, how does science advance? You've probably heard about science, we're standing on the shoulders of giants. In other words, things have been learned, and then instead of starting from scratch, you build on slowly over time on what's been learned previously. And that's called what's called a continuous model. Now, sometimes science undergoes kind of like a revolution, like Einstein's theory of gravity. It actually took decades for even a few people to begin to understand it. No one had even remotely come up, and it completely changed physics, theoretical physics. So that was a paradigm shift. Darwin's theory of evolution was a paradigm shift. Wegener's theory of plate tectonics, that was a paradigm shift. A lot of times science is very conservative, and people think, oh, we have a pretty good understanding, and someone comes up with a crazy-ass idea, and everybody else says you're crazy. And then it turns out years later that they were correct, like Wegener on plate tectonics. And then there's another thing. What evidence suggested the germ theory of disease? Technology. What kind of technology? What can we see with certain things and not with others? Microscope. Microscope, right. Before then, no one saw anything smaller than whatever it was in terms of a tenth of a millimeter or something like that. Okay? You couldn't see bacteria. Certainly couldn't see viruses. You couldn't even see cells. Okay? Well, you could, like an egg is a cell. A chicken egg is a full cell with a bunch of other stuff put in there. But people didn't know. So cell theory, that all came about because of new technology. So sometimes you really science can't go any further than it already has until they come up with new technology. Galileo. Well, people came up with telescopes before him, but he perfected them and he showed other planets with moons around them circling, which supported the heliocentric theory of the solar system where the planets revolve around the sun. But before there were telescopes, our view of what we thought was the universe was very, very restricted. And there's not much we could do until something came along that revealed, oh my God, there's more out there than we thought. In fact, like the Hubble Space Telescope has completely revamped our understanding of cosmology. The whole universe, how is it still expanding at an accelerating rate, all sorts of different things. So a lot of the reasons that scientific progress is made is because of technology that we didn't have before. And in fact, that's why cosmology and astronomy has seen incredible advances, whereas quantum, which is looking at very, very, very small things, has been fairly restricted because we haven't really come up. We've got the new Hadron Collider that can collide particles like protons and make them blow apart and see what's inside. But, and we discovered the Higgs boson, which is a kind of a fundamental particle recently. But theoretical physics has kind of been in a hole lately that they can't get out of in terms of their view of the universe. Okay. Anybody, what's a correlation? Who's it going to be? Yeah.
Relationship between two variables.
Yeah. See, it says up there. What does that mean?
It means that two things like relate to each other. You know.
Okay.
So it's like if my room's messy and it's raining outside, there's not really a correlation there.
Right.
But like, yeah, like if I just like packed up my room, then my room's clean. There's a correlation there.
Right. Okay. So, a correlation is condition A often coincides, that means happens, at the same time as condition B, or in the same direction. So, let's okay. Let's say body height and weight. Okay? And let's say I measured each of you. We'll say starts at, let's say, 4 feet. And then 5, 6, 7, 8. Okay? And we might say that, let's say someone who's 5 foot, we might see a dot. Let's put it there. A dot there, and a dot there, and a dot there. These are all different dots of size and weight. And we find out that there's a correlation, a positive correlation. It doesn't mean it's exact. Now, does height cause weight? No. Does weight cause height? No. They're just correlated. In fact, they're correlated because they're both measures of size. Okay? We could reduce this down to a single variable of size, some other measure of size. Okay. Now, correlation and causation. In other words, sometimes we can say, well, there's a correlation here, but is one thing causing another? let's say the amount of carbon that we're spewing into the atmosphere right now has increased. And we know that because of ice cores that we've taken from glaciers and tree ring data and a whole bunch of other things. And also the kind of carbon dioxide that we're finding isotopes of carbon that are more often found in the burning of fossil fuels. Okay, now, so we might do the same sort of thing. And we might have time on the bottom. Let's see, 1200, 1300, and all the way to 20th century. Or yeah, and then we'll have temperature in degrees, whatever it is. And we find out from glacier samples that have been around, that have been frozen for a long time, that little tiny air pockets actually get frozen in there, and you can actually measure them, and the amount of carbon dioxide in it, and the kind of carbon that is in it, and we see this correlation. Now, that doesn't prove causation, but it suggests that maybe there's something there. Now, because of some theoretical work in physics and gas laws and mathematical modeling of climate, temperature is just a part of climate, by the way, we can, let's say, come up with a mathematical model and perhaps come up with a model that actually explains what we're finding in nature in terms of how much carbon at a certain period of time. Now, there's certainly in the 19th century, there was all of a sudden an increase in the amount of CO2 going in the atmosphere, and that was basically when the industrial age really got going. And then it's been that way ever since. And if, in terms of climate science, there's the theory on how climate actually works and what are the inputs. It's very, I would say, complex because there's a lot of inputs that go into climate. Changes in temperature across the Earth's surface, all sorts of different things. But scientists now have a pretty good understanding, and it actually looks like there is cause and effect. But you cannot assume there's cause and effect until you actually go out and test it. So, correlation. The popularization of rap music in the late 1980s coincided with a sharp rise in narcotics use and violent crimes. I know this is true because I was around then, and I started listening to rap music, and I started doing heavy drugs, and I started going out on the street and doing crimes. I couldn't help myself. I swear to God. It was terrible. I mean, I knew who I was before then, and then all of a sudden I'm acting like, you know, a thug. I mean, it was bad. The cops were picking me up, but they kept letting me out. Eventually, I stopped listening to rap music, and then for some reason, my desire for doing narcotics and crimes went away. Can you believe that? No. Okay. Now, how about during the 1980s, that coincided with a sharp rise in narcotics use and violent crimes, that people started listening to more rap music, or rap music was created. How about that as causation? We've actually just shown that perhaps it's the other way around. In other words, cause and effect has been flipped. Still, correlation is not causation. In terms of this, it's hooey. I mean, they've been trying to show the same sort of thing with watching violent movies and then going out and wanting to rape people. Okay? Most people don't do that. They did, they get castrated. Now, sometimes it seems like there's causation and correlation, but here's one. People who wear seat belts are more likely to be diagnosed with cancer than those who do not wear seat belts. This is true, actually. Why? Anybody? Tell me something. Are you more likely to survive a car crash if you wore a seatbelt? Yes, right? If you don't, you're a missile right through the windshield, you're dead. That means your lifespan is shortened. The longer you live, the greater chance there is of actually getting cancer. If you live long enough, you'll probably get cancer. Okay? So, they're actually, seatbelts don't cause cancer, but they're correlated with seatbelts and all that because you're actually living longer. So, it's like this. Okay? So, next week we'll start on evolution. Please do the reading for evolution. I'm going to put up the top hat. I'm going to assign it for homework so you can practice on it. Okay? But like I mentioned, it's not really counting. It's just practice.